Hi, I'm Alfred Webre, and we're with Leuren Moret, and we're breaking in before our regularly scheduled update um, on the Fukushima global tectonic nuclear war with these uh, very alarming developments. The latest forecasts show that all of California is under a radiation threat on April 6th and 7th. Um, and uh, Canada has suspended mobile radiation measurements around Vancouver, BC, until further notice, even as a radiation cloud looms over the west. The latest forecast shows that all of California and the Northwest is under a radiation threat on April 6th and 7th, showing levels as high as in Japan. And radioactive iodine 131 in rainwater samples near San Francisco, California, is 18,100% above federal drinking water standards. Now, all of this information is being withheld from the public by the US government and by the Canadian government. So we have an ongoing false flag operation on the order of September 11th, 2001, the 2005 Katrina hurricane, and uh, um, the other false flag operations, including the BP Gulf oil spill. President Barack Obama has made no declarations so far, even though we now have maps, which I'm going to ask Leuren Moret about, showing that the radiation levels are as high on the west coast of California and Canada as they are in Japan. Welcome, Leuren.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
these maps are astounding because they show that the radiation now hitting the west coast of the US, and in fact on April 1st and 2nd, the Midwest are as high as the radiation levels in Japan. And as viewers will learn later on in this interview, scientists have now declared the northern one-third of Japan uninhabitable and recommended that it be evacuated.
That's correct. And what is happening is that radioactive particles and particulates and gases and liquids released from Fukushima are being transported across the North Pacific, and then they're moving down the Pacific coast. What these plumes and clouds are made of are billions and billions and billions of radioactive particles like this. This is a submicron particle with alpha tracks coming out of the center, and depending on the half-life of that particular element that forms the nucleus of this, or the particle, the particulate that's lodged in the tissues, these tracks represent, under the right conditions, a cancer, each one of those. It's a terrible, terrible hazard. It's a terrible situation. It's extremely serious, and eventually the diseases and illnesses around the world will be even worse than Chernobyl. The rates will be higher because the amount of particulates and these fission products that were in the spent fuel rods, and we now know that 3 pools of spent fuel rods blew up. This is what is being transported across the Pacific and around the world. If you look at maps of monitoring stations around the northern hemisphere, each day more and more stations are reporting detections of the Fukushima radiation. And it's now gone as far south as Colombia It's close to the equator, and eventually it will pass across the barrier. There's a kind of a barrier at the equator around the world that separates the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere air circulation. So there's nowhere to hide. There's no way to stop it. There's no way to turn it off.
Now, so that, is it correct, as these maps now show, this is being recorded on Monday, April 4th, that apparently on April 6th and 7th, levels as high as Japan will be hitting all of California, as well as the Northwest, Oregon, state of Washington, and the west coast of Canada.
Yes, and any map or dispersion pattern for a particular isotope, like iodine-131 or xenon or plutonium or whatever it is, represents in reality over 1,300 radioactive isotopes that are fission products from the fissioning of uranium and plutonium or plutonium. So we're not just looking at plumes and detection levels of iodine-131. That represents over 1,300 isotopes. And this is a nuclear war, Alfred. It's a global nuclear war that is in the northern hemisphere now, confined, but within a year it will be completely mixed globally in the entire atmosphere of the whole planet. And all living things will be affected. The bacteria, plants, animals, humans, everything. The fish in the sea, the whales, it's everyone. Everything is being poisoned. The terrible danger is, or the severity of the nuclear war depends on the weather. So where it rains out or where snow collects radioactive particles on the sharp edges and the pointy tips of the snowflakes, that's even a more efficient scavenger of radioactive particles. It'll be in our rivers, in our lakes, in our oceans, and wash up on the shoreline, where these particles are lofted into the air.
Well, now, we had, as we'll learn further on in the regularly scheduled program, Dr. Chris Busby and another eminent Project Manhattan scientist both have stated that the northern one-third of Japan is uninhabitable and should be evacuated based on the radiation levels there coming from the Fukushima plant. Now, if we have these radiation levels now coming over California, the Northwest, Oregon, state of Washington, and the western part of Canada, does that mean that this land will become uninhabitable and must be evacuated?
This is not going to be evacuated. Hawaii is not going to be evacuated. The same thing is going to happen globally that happened after Chernobyl. And the countries where weather patterns rain out or snow out the radiation will have more extreme rates of illnesses and more intense cases or more advanced exposures and biological responses. But I'm sorry, ask me again.
Yeah, i.e., if we're now being hit with as high levels of radiation as in Japan,
yes,
which the
yes.
maps are now showing,
right.
Does that mean that the western part of Canada, the Northwest, and California will become uninhabitable, and will it have to be evacuated?
I would say no. It's going to be chronic, low-level exposure for many, many decades, and the results will be similar to the results from Chernobyl, where it really, really impacted the Russian economy and collapsed it. It ended the Cold War because Russia was a sick old man. The workers were ill, the productivity went down, and it had a tremendous impact on the economy. This will happen all over the world, but North America, including Western Canada, the Western US, and Western Mexico, will be much more severely impacted than more distant places because of rain out over the Pacific Ocean and then rain out over the North and South America. And then as it travels across the Atlantic, there will be much more rain out there. And when it reaches Europe and Africa and the Southeast Asia, it will be even more diluted. But the effects will be noticeable. They will be global. They will be more severe in the Northern Hemisphere, but they will be the most severe in Japan, followed by North America. Now, also, what we know from the Chernobyl rainout of radioactive iodine, and this was for Japan, the Azores, Hawaii, the Stockholm in Sweden, the Western U.S., the Black Forest in Germany, the Eastern U.S., the west part of Russia, and Iceland, is that the highest rates of radioactive iodine were measured from Chernobyl were measured in Japan. The U.S. West Coast was next, although Hawaii was very similar, but peaked even higher because of high rainfall in Hawaii. So it's going to be the same pattern, very similar, but with more severe effects on the west coast of North America. And again, Hawaii had a lot of exposure in this disaster. Now, we're talking about radioactive releases that have been every day, 24 hours a day, released from Fukushima, traveling across the Pacific, across North America, and continuing around the world. So this is a chronic, low-level exposure to radiation that is accumulating in the environment as daily doses are delivered by the rain and snow into regions of the different continents. On top of that, it is in addition to what was already in our environment, contaminating it from nuclear bomb tests, Chernobyl, nuclear power plants, and the depleted uranium from the Middle East and Central Asian wars, as well as Yugoslavia. This has all had a global impact. It all continues to add to the severity and the rate of occurrence of chronic illnesses that were very rare before World War II. The miracle of the atomic age is not how the atomic age changed the world. It's how the atomic age changes you.
Now, here we have the evidence that the same levels of high radiation as in Japan are going to be over April 6th and 7th and continuing, as you say, as over Western Canada. And yet we have the news that Canada has now suspended mobile radiation measurements around Vancouver, BC, where it rains. It's raining today continuously and has all night, the entire night of April 3rd and now all day Monday, April 4th. And it's suspended mobile radiation measurements around Vancouver, BC until further notice as these radioactive cloud looms over Western Canada and over Vancouver, BC. What could be the motivation of Canada, the government of Canada, in this regard, other than a motivation to engage in genocide against its population?
Well, before the radioactive plume from the explosion of the first reactor that blew up arrived, the Canadian government moved the radiation monitoring program from, I think it was Victoria, to Kamloops, which was far inland and much further away from the high levels of iodine and other fission products that are now washing out today in the Vancouver region of BC. Well, the whole probably coastline of British Columbia. So that's an indicator right there that they were afraid of contaminating their own personnel and the equipment. It also is an indicator that they moved to a location where they would be reporting lower levels raining out, which is a deception because the highest levels are the greatest exposure, and you have to look at that as well as anything less. The peak exposures are very important to know. So also the U.S. has stopped measuring radiation in milk. They're not going to monitor it. Both Canada and the United States government and the Japanese government have increased, maybe doubled or even tripled the exposure limits. They've increased them to make it legal to cause genocide in North America. It's a total and complete criminal collusion between governments, and of course they did it during bomb testing. They did it during Chernobyl, and they've done the same thing to hide the effects of nuclear power plants, and again the depleted uranium, which I found in Los Angeles drinking water. So it's a nuclear war against humanity.
So would you say, that in your professional opinion, we have the collusion here of the President and the Prime Minister of Canada in this nuclear war against its population, in the same way that there was collusion in the 9/11 false flag, in the Hurricane Katrina false flag by the Bush administration, and in the BP oil spill by the Obama administration, specifically Barack Obama?
This is a collusion, a criminal collusion between not only politicians, including the Prime Minister of Japan, the Prime Minister Harper of Canada, and President Obama of the United States, but it's also a criminal collusion between regulatory agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, the health agencies in Canada, the government of Japan. They are all operating together, and it is in the best interest of the international bankers. So it's the financiers who are carrying out and benefiting from weapons of mass destruction, and this is not anything new.
Right. We're in the midst of an election campaign here in Canada at the national level for Prime Minister and for the National Parliament. It'll be held on May 2nd, 2011, and none of the parties, including the Green Party, which has raised any of these concerns about this nuclear war. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, it's a cover-up, as I said, at many levels. And the political parties, the politicians, the activists, they're all involved in the collusion. Their money comes from CIA and intelligence foundations. So in order to continue having funding for their activities, they have to be part of the cover-up and the collusion.
Right. We're now going to transition toward our regularly scheduled programming. Before we do you have any final comments for our audience?
Well, I'd just like to say that despite what governments are saying, despite what talking heads are saying on television, denying the harm, we in the Northern Hemisphere, and particularly in North America, are facing a terrible, terrible tragedy that will affect all of us. And in the years that come, there will be a very serious health crisis in the western regions of North America. I hope that we can do programs in the future, Alfred, that give people tips and information that will help them protect themselves and their children and the future generations from even more severe consequences. There are things, technologies, food quality, water quality, filters on water, drinking water that people can use and implement that will help to alleviate a more severe exposure if it's not modified. We need to take charge of our lives, of our health, of the quality of life that we may expect in the future.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to say that it's very ironic that uranium in the environment, which occurs naturally in rocks and minerals, has facilitated life to evolve into the perfect state that we know in nature up until the atomic age. And that uranium was a friend and a facilitator of evolution. It caused creations that became positive and helped people and organisms evolve to changing conditions. But the irony today is that they have released so much into the environment. It's such a health burden and a body burden now in humans and all other living things that it's just a slow death. It's a genocide for all living things. And it didn't have to happen.
Thank you, Leuren. Please stay tuned now for an extraordinary 60-minute interview with Leuren Moret on some breaking information, latest news on two world-class scientists who have declared that the northern one-third of Japan is now uninhabitable because of radiation and should be evacuated. Thank you.